Pope Francis just said something about Jesus that has left the world stunned. What he revealed shakes the very core of Christian belief and has people questioning everything they thought they knew. And with his recent bold moves on LGBTQ+ inclusion, women's leadership, and socialism, it's clear that this isn't just another moment in papal history. As he increasingly faces accusations of heresy, it's clear that Pope Francis's words mark a turning point. Could this be the moment that changes the Church forever? Let's find out. Pope Francis's radical church reforms. Pope Francis has been a unique figure in the long line of papal leaders, and from the very start of his papacy in 2013, it became clear that his approach would be unlike any other. Pope Francis's leadership has stood out from his predecessors by focusing on inclusion, humility, and engaging with global issues in a way the Church hasn't seen before. And now, his shocking words about Jesus are making waves around the globe. Could his recent statement change everything we thought we knew about the crucifixion? The Pope's intention to shift the Church's priorities was clear right from the moment he chose the name Francis. The name was a tribute to Saint Francis of Assisi, the 13th century saint known for his love of the poor, his renunciation of wealth, and his care for creation. In many ways, this choice signaled Pope Francis's intention to lead a church that would prioritize social justice and environmental stewardship, echoing the values embodied by his namesake. For centuries, the Catholic Church has been seen as a rigid institution, often associated with grandeur and tradition. The luxurious papal residences, for example, have long been a symbol of the Church's power and influence. But upon his election, Pope Francis made a surprising decision. He chose to live in the Vatican guest house rather than the Grand Apostolic Palace. This was a key decision reflecting his desire to live modestly, close to the people, and in a way that aligned with his vision of a church rooted in humility, one that seeks to serve the most vulnerable in society. But perhaps the most striking aspect of Pope Francis's leadership has been his commitment to modernizing the Church, which is crucial to understand before we can take a look at his recent statements about Christ's crucifixion. He has worked to bridge the gap between the Catholic Church and modern society, addressing some of the most pressing global issues of our time, such as climate change, poverty, and migration, and his efforts have shocked and offended many. Because Pope Francis is not merely calling for gradual change, he is challenging long-standing church practices and advocating for reforms that some see as radical. Let's start with climate change. In 2015, Pope Francis released Laudato Si', an encyclical dedicated entirely to the environment. This document, one of the most significant writings of his papacy, is essentially a plea for humanity to take better care of the planet. What's so groundbreaking about this? For centuries, environmental issues were not seen as central concerns for religious leaders. Yet, Pope Francis framed environmental destruction as a moral issue, emphasizing that the harm we do to the earth is an affront to the poor and vulnerable, who are often the first to suffer the consequences of climate disasters. He made it clear that climate change is not just a scientific or political issue, it's a spiritual one, rooted in the idea of care for our common home. And then there's Pope Francis's focus on addressing global poverty and inequality. From the early days of his papacy, Francis has made it clear that the Church must stand with the poor. He has called for a rethinking of global economic systems, criticizing capitalism for widening the gap between the rich and the poor, and arguing that wealth and power should not be the ultimate goals of society. Instead, he has urged for alternative economic systems that prioritize human dignity over profit. But what does this mean in practice? Take his many public statements on migration. In a world increasingly divided by borders and nationalist sentiments, Pope Francis has called on wealthier countries to welcome and care for migrants, refugees, and others fleeing poverty and persecution in their own home countries. His visits to refugee camps and meetings with migrants have been powerful symbols of his commitment to this cause. In this context, Pope Francis's recent, controversial remarks about Jesus have only fueled the growing tension around his leadership. Conservative factions within the Church argue that Pope Francis is shifting attention away from what they consider its main goal, saving souls. They claim his progressive agenda is weakening traditional teachings, especially on issues like capitalism and immigration. Despite this, Francis stands firm, insisting the Church cannot turn a blind eye to the suffering of the poor or the destruction of the planet, both of which he believes are essential to its mission in today's world. This tension between tradition and reform is at the core of his papacy, and it raises the question, can the Catholic Church evolve while staying true to its roots? And it's not just his stance on climate change and poverty that has made waves. Pope Francis has also advocated for greater inclusivity within the Church itself, especially to groups that have historically felt marginalized by religious institutions. This includes his controversial statements about LGBTQ+ individuals and his call for compassion and inclusion, famously stating, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about gay priests. Recently, one of his most ambitious projects has been the Synod on Synodality, a process that aims to make the Church more inclusive by engaging lay people, clergy, and bishops in a dialogue about the future direction of the Church. The crucifixion as a failure, Pope Francis's controversial view. Pope Francis stunned Catholics worldwide when he declared that Jesus' crucifixion ended in failure. These words were jarring, particularly for those who have been raised with the traditional view of Christ's death as the ultimate victory. Imagine hearing your spiritual leader suggest that the most defining moment in Christian history, the crucifixion, was, on a human level, a failure. How could the act that Christians have always seen as the ultimate expression of divine love and triumph over death be spoken of in this manner? But Pope Francis wasn't talking about failure in the way we might think. To understand his perspective, we have to unpack the deeper theological reasoning behind this statement. What Francis was pointing out was not that the crucifixion itself was a defeat of Christ's mission, but that, from a purely human viewpoint, it was a moment of profound suffering, abandonment, and rejection. This framing does not minimize the power of the resurrection, but instead draws our attention to the very human aspect of Jesus' sacrifice. He died on the cross as a man, experiencing the depths of human pain, loss, and despair. So why did Pope Francis make this statement? It seems that his purpose was to emphasize that the crucifixion was not about glory in the immediate sense. It wasn't an act of worldly power or control. It was the opposite. Jesus chose to face death, knowing full well the consequences, and in doing so, he united himself with all of humanity's suffering. In this sense, the failure of the cross is not a literal defeat, but a demonstration of the extent to which Jesus was willing to be vulnerable, weak, and broken, just as every human experiences weakness and suffering. The Pope's statement underscores the idea that Jesus' death is an example of radical humility, a complete surrender to love, even in the face of apparent failure. This focus on the human nature of Jesus, the vulnerability, and the failure, connects directly to a broader message of redemption. Pope Francis has long championed the idea that failure, suffering, and loss are innate parts of the human condition, and rather than avoiding them, they can lead to deeper spiritual growth. His interpretation of the crucifixion highlights that true victory doesn't come from avoiding suffering, but by embracing it and allowing it to transform us. This interpretation challenges the traditional focus on the crucifixion as solely a triumphant event, instead framing it as a journey through failure that leads to ultimate redemption. But of course, such a statement was bound to cause controversy. Many traditional Catholics and theologians were quick to voice their discontent, worried that this approach undermines the triumph of the resurrection. The Church has, for centuries, taught that the crucifixion and resurrection were two sides of the same coin, inseparable acts that together represented the ultimate victory over sin and death. By focusing on the failure of the cross, some argued Francis was diminishing the power of the resurrection, which is central to Christian faith. Theologians critical of this view have pointed out that the resurrection is the very reason Christians find hope in the crucifixion. Without the resurrection, Christ's death would indeed be a defeat. Paul the Apostle famously said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 14, "If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain." For those holding to this traditional interpretation, any suggestion that Jesus' death was a failure, whether human or divine, feels like a dangerous departure from orthodoxy. But Francis hasn't shied away from the backlash. In his defense, he has repeatedly clarified that his comments are not meant to deny the significance of the resurrection or to downplay the triumph of Christ's sacrifice. Instead, he frames his statement within the broader context of Christian teaching about humility and the paradox of the cross. For Pope Francis, the crucifixion is not just about power, it's about love. And love, as he often preaches, requires sacrifice. In the end, what Pope Francis seems to be asking is this: can we, like Jesus, embrace our moments of failure, not just as individuals but as a global society? As the world faces deeper crises, climate change, social unrest, economic injustice, are we willing to confront the possibility that it's our collective refusal to face failure and suffering that is driving us toward a breaking point? Francis challenges us to rethink the global consequences of our actions. What if it's not the suffering we should fear but our denial of it? If we keep ignoring the reality of our failures, could we be leading ourselves toward a future we can't recover from? The Pope struggles with heresy accusations. One of the most explosive controversies during Pope Francis's papacy has been the accusations of heresy thrown at him by traditionalist groups in the Church. These accusations stem from a number of reformative positions Francis has either openly supported or subtly endorsed, particularly regarding the crucifixion, LGBTQ+ inclusion, and divorce. His critics argue that, in his desire to make the Church more compassionate and welcoming, he's muddying the waters of what's doctrinally acceptable. One of the most infamous accusations of heresy came in 2019, when a group of conservative theologians and clergy formally accused Pope Francis of promoting ideas that clash with Catholic doctrine. Among their complaints was his statement that Jesus' crucifixion, humanly speaking, ended in failure, a claim that rattled many believers. To them, this remark seemed to challenge the very core of Christianity, which celebrates Christ's death as a victory over sin and death, not a defeat. Then there's Francis's approach to LGBTQ+ individuals and same-sex unions. His now iconic line, "Who am I to judge?" is often cited as proof that the Pope has softened the Church's stance on homosexuality. Further fueling the fire were his endorsements of blessings for same-sex couples, under certain conditions, which many see as a direct contradiction to the Church's long-standing teaching that marriage is a sacred union exclusively between a man and a woman. Critics accuse Francis of subtly changing Church doctrine, slowly erasing tradition in ways that could fundamentally alter the faith. Divorce is another topic that has led to fierce debates about Pope Francis's authority. In his official statement titled Amoris Laetitia, he called for greater flexibility regarding divorced and remarried Catholics, suggesting that in some cases, these individuals could receive communion. This flew in the face of centuries-old Church doctrine, which holds that remarriage without an annulment is sinful. The suggestion of allowing communion for these individuals sent shockwaves through the Catholic world and triggered a wave of backlash, with some accusing Francis of undermining the sacred union of marriage itself. The formal letters from conservative theologians and clergy have not held back. In the infamous 2019 Filial Correction, Pope Francis was accused of promoting 7 heretical positions related to marriage, divorce, and sin. The signers argued that his emphasis on mercy and inclusion was leading to religious and social chaos, blurring the lines between right and wrong. They demanded that Francis clarify his teachings and reassert traditional Catholic doctrine. But Pope Francis has not backed down. He's made it clear that his focus on mercy and inclusion doesn't contradict Church teachings but rather brings them into action in a way that addresses the real needs of the modern world. To Francis, the Church should not be a distant institution that imposes rules from above. It should walk with people through their struggles, offering mercy and guidance rather than condemnation. In his vision, the Church is a field hospital for those who are wounded, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. In this context, pastoral care means standing alongside people in their brokenness and helping them heal. Today, as the Pope pushes harder for reforms and new approaches to long-standing Church doctrines, the divide between traditionalists and progressives is widening at a dangerous pace. The stakes have never been higher, and the future of the Church hangs in the balance. Misconduct scandals within the Church exposed. One of the most explosive and controversial challenges Pope Francis has faced is the Church's ongoing crisis related to mistreatment and misconduct of vulnerable individuals by powerful clergy members. This issue has severely damaged the Church's reputation and sparked global outrage, with calls for justice growing louder each year. Francis has tried to confront the issue head-on, making it one of his central focuses, but his efforts have sparked fierce debate both inside and outside the Church. Early in his papacy, Francis admitted the gravity of the situation, vowing to take action. He recognized the need for deep reform, particularly in how the Church handles allegations against its clergy. His approach has focused on greater transparency and holding powerful Church figures accountable. He also sought to create systems where victims could seek justice. One of his boldest moves was creating a special tribunal to investigate bishops accused of covering up cases of misconduct. This was a major shift, as bishops had traditionally been untouchable within their diocese, enjoying almost complete autonomy. Setting up tribunals sent a clear message: no one, not even high-ranking officials, would escape scrutiny. But even with these efforts, critics argue Francis hasn't gone far enough. Victims groups say the tribunal system, while a step forward, is slow and lacks teeth. Some bishops accused of shielding offenders still hold positions of power, fueling frustration among those demanding accountability. Things reached a boiling point in 2018 when the scandal involving American Cardinal Theodore McCarrick exploded. McCarrick had been accused of misconduct for years, yet managed to retain his influence until his forced resignation in 2018. While Francis eventually removed him from the priesthood, the delay was seen as a clear sign that the Church's response was too slow and reactive. This case reignited the debate over whether the reforms put in place by Francis were strong enough to deal with the scale of the problem. Another source of anger has been the perceived lack of support for survivors. Though Francis has met with survivors and apologized for the Church's failures, many believe the Church hasn't provided enough in terms of financial support, counseling, or reparations. Critics say symbolic gestures are not enough. Victims need real, concrete action that prioritizes their well-being over protecting the institution. At the heart of this issue is the question of whether Francis's reforms have created a true culture of accountability within the Church. On one side, his investigative bodies and tribunals are seen as significant progress. On the other, the slow pace of reform and new revelations of misconduct suggest the culture of secrecy and protection remains deeply ingrained. Many wonder, can the Church truly reform from within, or is the rot too deep? Pope Francis has acknowledged these criticisms but remains steadfast in his commitment to reform, insisting that change within an institution as massive as the Catholic Church takes time. He has emphasized the need for a zero-tolerance policy, ensuring that any form of misconduct is immediately addressed. Yet, as many point out, the gap between his words and real change is still frustratingly wide. While Francis has undoubtedly changed how the Church handles cases of misconduct, it hasn't been enough for many victims and reform advocates. The question remains, can Francis truly rebuild trust with those the Church has failed? How much more must be done to ensure real justice is achieved? One thing is clear, until the Church fully addresses these past failures, it will struggle to move forward with the rest of its reform agenda. Outrage over LGBTQ+ inclusion and women leaders. Pope Francis's approach to both LGBTQ+ inclusion and the role of women in the Church has sparked intense controversy, perhaps more than any other issue during his papacy. These topics have divided the Church and raised urgent questions about its future direction, igniting a firestorm of debate between progressives and traditionalists. It all started in 2013 when Pope Francis asked, "Who am I to judge?" in response to a question about gay individuals within the Church. That one line sent shockwaves through the Catholic community, marking a clear shift in tone from previous popes. Francis was signaling a Church that wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about embracing compassion and inclusion. For many, it was a sign of hope, especially for LGBTQ+ Catholics who had long felt alienated by the Church's teachings. One notable example of the Pope's commitment to inclusion was during the Synod on Synodality, where LGBTQ+ Catholics shared deeply personal stories about their faith journeys and struggles with exclusion. This synod, held in Rome, offered a unique platform for LGBTQ+ voices, including individuals from countries where LGBTQ+ topics are taboo. The event highlighted how LGBTQ+ Catholics in places like Africa face unique challenges compared to those in more liberal areas such as Europe. Yet, their experiences reflect a universal desire for inclusion and respect, which Pope Francis has openly supported, even amidst internal resistance. Moreover, in 2021, Pope Francis met with 4 transgender women in a historic encounter, signaling his commitment to welcoming marginalized communities. These women, who had felt alienated from the Church due to their gender identities, described the meeting as a moment of healing. One participant shared that Pope Francis's compassionate approach made her feel seen and accepted, a sharp contrast to the hostility she had faced from some Church leaders. This meeting was more than just symbolic, it was a real step toward bridging the gap between the Church and LGBTQ+ Catholics. Then this January, Pope Francis took an even more radical step, endorsing the blessing of same-sex couples under specific circumstances. For a Church that has long taught that such relationships are contrary to its understanding of marriage, this was seismic. While Francis didn't call for a full endorsement of same-sex marriage, his approval of blessings for these unions was still a dramatic departure from what had been the official stance. For the LGBTQ+ community and their supporters, this was seen as an important gesture of respect and dignity, acknowledging the love and commitment in these relationships. But for many high-ranking bishops and cardinals, this move was seen as a grave threat, shaking the foundations of the Church's long-held beliefs about relationships and family life. The fear was palpable. Was Francis going too far? Critics are not just concerned with the theological implications, they see a broader danger. By softening the Church's stance on these issues, they argue Francis risks sending the message that doctrine is flexible, that the Church can bend to societal pressures rather than standing firm in its teachings. This has led to calls for clarity, with many accusing the Pope of causing confusion among the faithful, confusion that could threaten the very stability of the Church. Yet, Francis has continued to push forward, not just on LGBTQ+ issues, but on another area that has sent shockwaves through the Church: women's roles. Under his leadership, more women have been appointed to senior positions in the Vatican than ever before. Historically, these positions have been almost exclusively held by men, reflecting the deeply entrenched hierarchy of the Church. However, Francis has made it clear that he believes women should have a much greater role in Church leadership. For example, he appointed Sister Natalie Beckcourt as the first woman to hold a voting position in the Synod of Bishops, a council responsible for advising the Pope on important matters. This was a groundbreaking decision, as it gave a woman formal influence in a body that has traditionally been dominated by male clergy. But Pope Francis didn't stop there. He has also appointed several women to key leadership roles in the Roman Curia, the administrative body of the Vatican. These appointments reflect his broader commitment to promoting women's leadership within the Church, challenging centuries-old norms that limited women to more peripheral roles. By giving women these positions of authority, Francis is not just changing the face of Church leadership. He's also sending a message that the Church must evolve to reflect the realities of the modern world. The most intense debate centers around the possibility of appointing women as deacons, something that would have been unthinkable in previous papacies. This is a role that would allow women to assist in liturgical services, preach and perform certain sacraments. The idea of women deacons isn't entirely new. In the early centuries of the Church, women served as deacons in some Christian communities, performing a variety of ministerial functions. However, this practice eventually faded, and for the past millennium, the role of deacon has been reserved exclusively for men. Now, under Pope Francis, there is renewed interest in revisiting this tradition. The discussions within the Synod on synodality reflect this growing momentum, as participants from around the world engage in deep theological debates about the role of women in ministry. But with these discussions comes tension. Conservative factions within the Church, including some bishops and cardinals, have voiced strong opposition to the idea of women deacons. They argue that this would fundamentally alter the Church's teachings on gender and ministry, potentially leading to the dismantling of the male-only priesthood tradition. For centuries, the Catholic Church has upheld the belief that the priesthood is reserved for men, based on the example set by Jesus and his male apostles. Any move to ordain women would, in their eyes, represent a direct challenge to this doctrine. It's not just about changing one role, it's about opening a door that, once opened, can never be closed again. While these reforms continue to stir controversy, the dialogues and debates are essential for progress, sparking a deeper reflection within the Church about its role and responsibilities in a changing world. Is Pope Francis pushing socialism? Pope Francis has sparked outrage and admiration in equal measure with his bold stance on economic justice. From the beginning of his papacy, he hasn't minced words. He has openly condemned the global economic systems that prioritize profit over people, and his biting critique of capitalism has become one of the most fiercely debated aspects of his teachings. In Francis's view, economy should serve humanity, not enslave it. But the real shock comes when you consider how far he's willing to push this message, and the fierce backlash it's generated. One of the key reasons his economic views have caused such an uproar is their connection to liberation theology, a controversial framework born out of Latin America in the mid-20th century. This theology argues that the Church must stand with the oppressed and challenge unjust systems, particularly economic ones that widen the gap between rich and poor. Francis, coming from Argentina, has been influenced by this way of thinking, even though he has distanced himself from its more radical proponents. For Francis, this isn't just a political stance, it's a moral one. His critics, however, aren't convinced. They claim his emphasis on the poor and on economic redistribution veers dangerously close to socialism, a label that has only heightened the controversy surrounding his papacy. In 2013, he made headlines when he referred to the unfettered pursuit of money as the dung of the devil in his encyclical Evangelii Gaudium. His scathing critique was a clear warning against idolizing free markets and unchecked capitalism. He argued that the economy must be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable citizens, not by how much profit it generates for the few. To the business world, this was a direct hit. Many saw it as a rejection of the economic system that has lifted millions out of poverty. Economists and political leaders accused Francis of promoting dangerous ideas that, in their view, undermine personal responsibility and the values of hard work and charity. But Pope Francis's stance is more than just theory, it's rooted in real-world consequences. The Pope argues that the current global economy treats people like disposable resources. In his view, this throwaway culture dehumanizes workers, reduces them to mere tools of production, and sacrifices the dignity of individuals for corporate gain. For him, this isn't just an economic issue, it's a moral crisis. His call for governments to step in and correct economic injustices has led to accusations that he's advocating for socialism. Critics say state intervention could destroy personal freedom and lead to government overreach. But for Francis, the stakes are too high to leave economic systems unchecked. The question is, how far can he push these ideas before triggering a backlash that could unravel his broader mission? In his encyclical Laudato Si', Francis goes even further, linking economic injustice to the destruction of the planet. He argues that the same greed driving wealth inequality is also wreaking havoc on the environment. This is where his vision becomes truly radical. Francis calls for a complete overhaul of the global economic system, not just to protect the poor but to save the planet itself. For him, economic justice and environmental justice are inseparable. And while this vision has inspired millions, it has also intensified opposition from those who fear that such sweeping changes could lead to economic collapse. Despite the fierce opposition, Francis has remained unshaken. He continues to call out what he sees as the dangers of unchecked capitalism. His critics insist that free markets have brought prosperity to millions, arguing that entrepreneurship, innovation, and competition are essential to economic progress. But Francis doesn't buy into this narrative. For him, any economic system that leaves people behind is a failure. He's not interested in incremental reforms, he's calling for a complete moral rethinking of the way the world approaches wealth, power, and dignity. Ultimately, Pope Francis's vision is about more than economics. It's about creating a world where human dignity comes first. His critics argue that this idealistic vision risks destroying the very systems that have created wealth and lifted people out of poverty. But Francis remains steadfast, insisting that economies must serve people, not the other way around.